Profits have increased to record levels, $70 billion in the first half of this year alone for the top 5 oil companies. And the justifications for keeping those subsidies in place haven't materialized. There's no increase in jobs in America. In fact, offshoring continues. So, we couldn't agree more that we need to be looking at the specific subsidies, trying to root them out of the intricacies of the tax code where they're buried, and get them out of our system. That being said, I think we do need to recognize that direct subsidies for fossil fuels are only the tip of the iceberg and the least important kinds of subsidies that help make them have such a dominant position in our economy and our society. Indirect subsidies, which are far larger, include devoting a huge percentage of our military budget to patrolling the supply lanes for oil companies and get their product to market, paying for vast infrastructure up front. Look at the interstate highway system, which is probably the largest investment in a single product and supply chain for the oil companies that's ever been envisioned. And then finally, allowing fossil fuel companies and folks who are using fossil fuels to use the Earth's atmosphere and rivers as a dumping ground for their products. A recent study from the National Academy of Science estimated costs at $62 billion a year from coal pollution alone. That's without thinking about the cost of global warming and the issues from greenhouse gases. And another study estimated that the true cost of carbon pollution would be make gas about $13 a gallon if you actually incorporate it in there. So we strongly agree we should be eliminating those subsidies, but we shouldn't have any illusions that doing that would get us to where we need to go in terms of creating a truly leveling playing field between fossil fuels and the kind of clean and efficient energy that we know we need to get to in terms of replacing that. Areas in the report that we're concerned about, areas in the discussion that we're concerned about. On the specific level, we're concerned about many of the report recommendations which would eliminate essential support for clean energy programs. And I'll just highlight a few, and I think we'll get to some in questions. First, there's a critical program called the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, otherwise known as ARPA-E. It's a critical program that builds on research and development efforts that have successfully been used for the Defense Department, the kind of program that led to the internet and the growth of the computer industry. And it's something we need to support and have more investment in rather than less. That's a recommendation that Bill Gates, who spoke at our annual event earlier this year, was really focused on, and we strongly agree. Loan guarantees are a critical piece of support for new fuel companies. There's a lot of essential programs for rural clean energy, like biomass crop assessment, biomass refinery assistance. We do need to stop subsidies for first-generation fuels like corn ethanol, but a lot of these subsidies that are targeted in the report, we would strongly move. But, I guess on a macro level, what I'd say is that we need to focus on 2 key things in this discussion. One, competitiveness and job creation, in addition to deficit reduction. To observers in other countries like China and India, it must look like we're intent on scoring the largest own goal in human history by focusing narrowly on deficit reduction, and while they're investing trillions in building their competitive infrastructure and supporting critical industries for tomorrow's economy. And secondly, we need a balanced approach to deficit reduction that grows revenues as well as makes cuts. Solely focusing on cuts obscures recognition of fundamental factors that have led to the recent deficit issues. Most fundamentally, we decided to wage 2 wars for the first time in American history without having any tax increases to offset the cost of those wars. And in fact, we went the other direction. We put in place massive tax cuts that our political system is in danger of making permanent. So those are the fundamental issues. We need to address those. We need to do it in a way that makes us competitive, creates jobs, and allows us to face the challenges of the future.
Thank you, Russ. Andy.
Well, thank you very much. I am Andy Nicholas of the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. The Budget and Policy Center was founded about 5 years ago. We are based out of Seattle here, And we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that focuses on state-level budget and tax issues, and particularly how those issues affect lower and moderate income families in our state. And sort of building off what Ross just said, I'm going to take the position that we actually have no immediate deficit problem. The only immediate problem that we have right now is a sick economy. We do have a longer-term debt problem that does need to be addressed, but it is imperative that we look at our immediate economic problems, because if we don't do that, we're not going to be in any position to deal with the longer-term debt issue. So there are 3 key points that I hope you all will take away from my part of the presentation today. The first is that, as I said, the first priority among policymakers, both at the federal and at the state level, has to be fixing the economy now. It doesn't matter what this so-called super committee does later this year. There isn't going to be significant debt reduction unless we focus on economic growth, job creation, and the like now. This is the wrong time to be talking about imposing deep and serious cuts to essential national health, education, and transportation structures, or large increases or large tax increases right now. That both of these actions could harm our short-term economic recovery, which would make the long-term debt reduction debate much more difficult to have and much more difficult to achieve. Secondly, we need a balanced, responsible, and long-term approach to deficit reduction. It's important to remember that before this deficit super committee takes up any action, that as part of the bill that set this up, there were already $1 trillion over 10 years in cuts that were enacted. So whatever this committee comes up with, that's going to be on top of $1 trillion in all cuts that have already been enacted. This means that it's imperative that revenue increases be considered part of this debate, that in our view, at least half of the debt solution has to involve revenue increases, either probably through a combination of getting rid of targeted tax breaks, which is a substantial part of what we're talking about here today, and probably letting some or all of the Bush tax cuts expire. To the extent that we are looking at cuts, and we should, those have to be made smartly. We shouldn't simply shift costs from the government to struggling seniors, workers, and struggling families. We need to do smart cuts that cut costs system-wide and that enable us to maintain quality and access in key programs like healthcare and education by bending the cost all across the economy, not just simply shifting costs from the government to taxpayers. And my final point is that it is imperative that we protect crucial supports for lower and moderate income families in this process. That key programs like Medicaid, food stamps, temporary assistance for needy families, the earned income tax credits, successfully lift millions of families out of poverty every year. These programs have enormous benefits for the economy at large. Cutting them dramatically would only harm our shared prosperity in the long run and would make our short-term recovery much longer. So just to recap, again, 3 major points. Fixing our economy now has to be the #1 priority. Number 2, we need a balanced, responsible, and above all, long-term approach to deficit and debt reduction. And finally, we need to protect those crucial supports for our lower and moderate income families. And look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Andy. Why don't you go ahead, Paul?
As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm Paul Guppy. I'm Vice President for Research with the Washington Policy Center, and we're an independent think tank based here in Seattle. I'll also mention that my wife and I are foster parents, and so we really see some of the needs that are in society. And the reason I mention that is sometimes the system's response, government's response, or Congress or the super committee to any kind of fundamental change is like that of the many high needs foster kids that I've had in my home, which is screaming, yelling, and tantruming that doesn't lead to any productive result. So I think the first hurdle that the super committee has to get over is this resistant culture that's in Washington, D.C. to any kind of basic change in the way the government operates. And for that reason, I was very encouraged. I've been familiar with Green Scissors in the past, but the reason that we at the Washington Policy Center like this approach so much is because Green Scissors asks exactly the kind of basic questions that should be asked through this super committee process or even through Congress itself. And that is, should government be engaged in this activity at all, whatever it is, subsidies or programs? Particularly a lot of the agricultural subsidies, energy subsidies, subsidies that go to profitable companies. I'm all in favor of profitable companies because they pay taxes. But the government really has to stop and think as to what public interest is served by providing subsidies to an economic activity that's already ongoing or successful. The second thing I would point out, which I'm sure is a little more controversial, is that most people don't think of government itself as being a special interest. But often it is. There are many groups that benefit from government activities, certain programs, certain tax subsidies, or even people who work in government itself. That's an ongoing business for them. Their business is the public sector. So whenever funding for a public sector entity is threatened or there's discussion about reducing its rate of growth, government itself can function like a special interest within the system, not just lobbying and special interests from the outside. The second point I would make is we have to keep the word cuts in perspective. So only in the public sector, when people talk about cuts, are they almost always, 99% of the time, we're actually discussing reductions in the rate of spending increase. So it was mentioned that the super committee has to look at $1.3 trillion in cuts over 10 years. Believe me, 10 years from now, the federal government will be much larger and more costly than it is today, whether those cuts are enacted or not. So this entire discussion is really about not reducing the absolute size of government, but instead determining whether its future expansion is sustainable based on the taxes that are produced by our economy. So I was asked also, well, what is our perspective about the problem or how do we describe the problem that our country faces today? And a basic divide in the debate is, well, is it a spending problem? Do we need a balanced approach? Do we need new revenues? As you can probably tell from what I just said, I think new revenues will really only make the problem worse. Higher taxes, and this has been demonstrated over the last 50 years, higher permanent taxes lead to higher permanent spending by the government. So that doesn't really get spending under control. It just feeds more money into the system. I've heard congressmen themselves describe it as the same as giving an alcoholic a drink. All it does is encourage politicians to spend more money, rewards them when they secure a new revenue stream or increase existing taxes. The signal that's heard in Washington, D.C., and I worked for the Appropriations Committee in the House, is, boy, do they love to spend money. Democrat, Republican, Independent, it doesn't matter. Just as long as the Appropriations Committee secures more control over more trillions of dollars, whether borrowed, higher taxes, it doesn't matter. That's the culture inside Congress. I think the thing that balances that out is finally when the public begins to say, enough. We are not providing you public officials with more than these several $1 trillion that you already have. By the way, I looked up that the number trillion, which is huge, but think about this. 1 trillion seconds is more than 31,000 years. And our government spends several $1 trillion a year. The government also it borrows 43 cents of every dollar that it spends today. So it doesn't take too much thinking to realize that this trend is completely unsustainable into the future. It's also unfair, both for working people today by not using public money effectively, and that's why this report is so important, and it's unfair to our children and our grandchildren, future generations. And the reason for that is we today are expecting our children as taxpayers to not only pay for 100% of the government services that they will have in the future, but we're asking them to pay, requiring them to pay 43% of the public services that we're consuming right now. So it's really about bringing fairness to the system to get spending under control, discipline to Congress, who are our representatives, and telling them through the super committee or just through general public opinion, enough is enough, and more spending will not solve our long-term problem. Thanks.
Thank you.